The air in lower Manhattan was not merely cold. It was thick, a suffocating soup of coal smoke, rotting refuse, and the salt-heavy breath of the East River. By 1854, New York City had become a sprawling labyrinth of ambition and despair, where the glittering mansions of Fifth Avenue felt worlds away from the squalor of the Five Points. Here, the sun rarely touched the cobblestones. Instead, it was filtered through a web of drying laundry and leaning tenements that seemed to groan under the weight of the thousands packed inside. In the damp basements and drafty attics of these brick tombs, the ghostly children were born of necessity. Thousands of orphans and runaways who lived in the cracks of a society that had moved too fast to care for its smallest citizens. Among them was 10-year-old Leo, a boy whose ribs traced a jagged map of hunger beneath his thin cotton shirt. He was a street Arab, a term the newspapers used to describe the legion of children who slept on steam grates and inside discarded crates. To Leo, the city was a beast that never slept. He spent his days dodging the heavy wheels of horse-drawn omnibuses and his nights huddled with other boys for warmth, their breathing synchronized in the rhythmic shivering of the malnourished. They were invisible to the men in top hats and the women in silk hoop skirts who stepped over them as if they were nothing more than piles of soot. In this world, childhood was a luxury no one could afford, and the future was a concept that didn't extend past the next scrap of bread. The tenements themselves were breeding grounds for more than just poverty. They were haunted by the ghosts of those who had already succumbed to typhus and cholera. In the flickering light of tallow candles, the faces of the children looked like pale specters, their eyes too large for their sunken cheeks, reflecting a weary wisdom that no child should possess. They were the discarded byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, the sons and daughters of immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic with dreams only to find themselves buried in the slums. It was in this suffocating darkness that a radical, terrifying, and hopeful whisper began to circulate through the alleys. They spoke of a great iron horse and a man named Charles Loring Brace who promised a land of endless green, far beyond the smoke-choked horizon of the city. To a boy like Leo, who had never seen a tree that wasn't stunted by soot, the idea of the West sounded like a fairy tale. But as the first whistles of the locomotives echoed in the distance, a chilling realization took hold. To find a life, they would first have to die to their old selves, leaving behind their names, their families, and the only home they had ever known to become the wandering spirits of the rails. The promise of the city had curdled like sour milk. By the mid-1850s, the fragile social fabric of New York didn't just tear, it disintegrated. For the street Arabs like Leo, the struggle for survival shifted from a daily chore to a desperate war. The charity of the churches had run dry, and the city's few almshouses were bursting at the seams, leaving a literal army of 30,000 homeless children to roam the gutters. These were not just orphans in the traditional sense. Many were half-orphans, children whose parents were still alive, but so broken by drink, disease, or the crushing weight of unemployment that they had simply cast their offspring into the streets to fend for themselves. The bread lines became the focal point of their existence, miserable, winding queues of gray faces stretching around icy corners. Leo stood among them, his bare feet tucked beneath the hem of his oversized trousers to shield them from the slush. The air was filled with the metallic tang of blood and the sour stench of the docks. When the wagons finally arrived, the bread was often little more than hard, weevil-ridden crusts, yet men and children fought over them with a primal ferocity. To hold a loaf was to hold a heartbeat. To lose it was to flirt with the grave. It was a societal collapse so absolute that the city's elite began to view these children not as victims to be saved, but as a dangerous class that threatened to ignite a revolution of the poor. The broken promises were etched into every street sign. The American dream, shouted from the printing presses of nearby newspaper row, told tales of prosperity and grit. But for the boys huddling under the piers, the only grit they knew was the soot in their lungs. Leo remembered his mother's promise, that the voyage from Ireland would lead to a golden door. But that door had slammed shut the moment she succumbed to the consumption in a windowless room on Mulberry Street. Now the city authorities spoke of reform, yet their only solution was the House of Refuge, a prison-like reformatory where children were beaten into submission. The streets offered freedom, but it was a freedom that tasted of hunger and smelled of death. As the winter of 1854 tightened its grip, the desperation reached a fever pitch. Rumors began to swirl that the child savers were no longer just offering soup, they were offering an exit. The Children's Aid Society posted flyers that many of the boys couldn't read, but the illustrations spoke volumes, a golden sun rising over a farmhouse. It was a seductive lie to some and a final hope to others. The broken promises of the city had left these children with nothing, no names that carried weight, no homes to return to, and no protection from the law. They were the living debris of a collapsing urban experiment. As Leo watched a younger girl collapse from exhaustion in the middle of a crowded thoroughfare, ignored by the rushing crowds, he realized that the city had finished with them. They were ghosts long before they ever stepped onto a train. In the high-ceilinged offices of the newly formed Children's Aid Society, the air was scrubbed clean of the tenement stench, replaced by the scent of expensive parchment and ink. Here sat Charles Loring Brace, a man of intense gaze and rigid moral certainty. He was a minister by training, but a social engineer by temperament. To the wealthy donors of New York, he was a visionary, a savior plucked from the pages of a Dickensian novel. To the thousands of children shivering in the docks, however, he was becoming something far more complex, the architect of exile. Brace looked out at the city and did not see individuals with histories. He saw a surplus population of misery that needed to be drained away for the health of the Republic. Brace's philosophy was born of a peculiar mix of genuine compassion and cold, Victorian pragmatism. He believed the city was a pestilence that corrupted the innocent. In his view, the dark alleys of the 5 Points were not just places of poverty, but crucibles of crime that would eventually produce a generation of revolutionaries and thieves. His solution was as grand as it was terrifying. The best of all asylums for the outcast child is the farmer's home. He didn't want to build better orphanages or provide social safety nets in the city. He wanted to physically transplant the problem. He envisioned a human pipeline, an iron artery that would carry the waste of New York to the virgin soil of the American West, where hard labor and Christian discipline would purify the street-hardened souls of children like Leo. The founding of the Children's Aid Society in 1853 marked the beginning of an era of unprecedented social experimentation. Brace was a master of persuasion, convincing the public that the emigration of these children was an act of divine mercy. He spoke of the wholesome air of the prairies and the sturdy character of the pioneer family. Yet, there was a darker undercurrent to his vision. By shipping children thousands of miles away, he was effectively severing their roots. To Brace, the parents of these children, often poor Irish or German immigrants, were unfit elements whose influence needed to be erased. He wasn't just moving children. He was orchestrating a cultural lobotomy, or as critics would later whisper, a legalized kidnapping of the poor. Lee first saw the architect during a recruitment sermon at a lodging house. Brace stood at the pulpit, his voice echoing with the authority of a man who believed he held the keys to salvation. He spoke of vast horizons and families waiting with open arms, but he failed to mention the legal contracts that would bind these children to strangers until they reached adulthood. He didn't mention that siblings would be split like kindling, or that a child's religion, often Catholic, would be traded for the Protestantism of the frontier. As Brace signed the orders that would organize the first Orphan Train, he believed he was clearing a path to heaven. In reality, he was drafting the blueprints for a journey that would turn thousands of living children into ghosts of their former selves, wandering a land that did not know their names. The morning of the departure was draped in a thick, sulphurous fog that clung to the iron skeletons of the Hudson River piers. For Leo and the 40-odd children gathered at the station, the world had narrowed down to the size of a cardboard valise. Each child had been scrubbed until their skin was raw and dressed in a suit of stiff. New clothes provided by the society, garments that felt like costumes for a play they hadn't rehearsed. In their hands, they clutched a small Bible and a piece of paper that served as their only currency, a ticket to a destination that didn't yet have a name. To the officials, it was a logistical triumph. To the children, it was the moment the earth began to tilt. Towering over the platform stood the Iron Giant, a soot-stained locomotive that hissed and groaned like a tethered beast. It was a terrifying marvel of steam and steel, its funnel-belching black plumes that merged with the gray New York sky. For many of these children who had never ventured beyond the 5-block radius of their slum, the train was more than a vehicle. It was a hungry mouth waiting to swallow them whole. As the conductor's whistle shrieked, a piercing, mournful cry that echoed off the brick warehouses, Leo felt a sudden, violent surge of vertigo. Behind him lay the familiar filth of the city, the only home that had ever claimed him. Ahead lay a void of mapless prairies and the terrifying uncertainty of the West. The boarding process was a blur of barked orders and small, muffled whimpers. There were no long goodbyes. For most, there was no one left to say goodbye to. Yet, as they climbed the iron steps, some children looked back toward the city skyline, perhaps searching for the ghost of a mother's face or the familiar shadow of a tenement stoop. The interior of the car was cramped and smelled of varnish and anxiety. As the train lurched forward with a bone-jarring shudder, the connection to their past lives was physically severed. The rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels began to play a funeral march for their identities. Every mile gained was a memory lost. As the cityscape began to dissolve into the blurred greens and browns of the countryside, the silence inside the carriage became heavy. The children stared out the windows, their reflections ghost-like against the glass. They were crossing an invisible threshold, moving from the known misery of the urban hive to the unknown wilderness of the frontier. They were passengers of fate, carried by a machine they didn't understand toward a future they couldn't imagine. By the time the sun began to set over the Jersey marshes, the New York they knew had vanished into a smudge of smoke on the horizon. They were no longer the street Arabs of the 5 Points. They were the first shipment of a new American experiment, hurtling through the dark toward a destiny written in steam and iron. As the city vanished into a hazy smudge of charcoal and gray, the world began to move at a speed that felt violent to those accustomed to the slow crawl of the slums. For Leo and the children huddled on the hard wooden benches, the journey became a hypnotic, sensory assault. The train was not merely a carriage. It was a living, breathing entity of friction and heat. The most pervasive element was the soot, a fine black dust that seeped through the cracks of the window frames, coating their new Sunday clothes and settling into the pores of their skin. Within hours, the pristine charity look was gone, replaced by the familiar grime of the rails, making them look once again like the urchins they were trying to leave behind. Then there was the sound, the eternal driving rhythm of the tracks. Click-clack, click-clack. At first, the noise was a novelty, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to promise progress. But as the hours stretched into days, the rhythm became a psychological weight. It was the sound of distance. Each click represented another foot of separation from the only reality they knew. The tracks were a one-way bridge, and the clicking was the sound of the gates locking behind them. Some of the younger children tried to sing against the roar of the engine, their voices thin and reedy, eventually swallowed by the metallic groans of the car as it swayed precariously on the uneven iron rails of the mid-19th century. The view through the glass was a moving daguerreotype of an America they hadn't known existed. The cramped, vertical world of the tenements was replaced by a terrifying horizontality. The sky, once a mere strip of blue between brick walls, now loomed over them, vast and indifferent. They passed through forests that seemed to have no end and skirted the edges of misty valleys where the only sign of life was the occasional flicker of a farmhouse lantern in the twilight. To children raised in the hive of New York, where you were never more than an arm's length from another human soul, this emptiness was haunting. It felt as though they were being pulled into a vacuum, a place where their voices would simply drift away into the wind without ever hitting a wall. At night, the car became a chamber of ghosts. The oil lamps flickered and smoked, casting long, dancing shadows against the ceiling. The smell was a suffocating mix of unwashed bodies, stale bread, and the pungent aroma of wood smoke from the engine. Sleep was fitful. Every time the train shrieked or slowed for a watering station, hearts would race with the fear that they had arrived, or that they were being abandoned in the middle of the dark nothingness. Leo watched the sparks from the smokestack fly past the window like dying stars. In the rhythmic swaying of the carriage, he felt the city of New York receding into the realm of myth. The soot under his fingernails was the only thing that felt real, a physical reminder of the world that had burned him out and cast him into the night. The rhythm of the rails finally slowed to a gut-wrenching halt in a dusty town in Illinois. As the steam cleared and the heavy iron doors creaked open, the children were ushered out into the blinding glare of the Midwestern sun. For Leo, the transition was jarring. The silence of the prairie was louder than the roar of the city. They were marched toward a local town hall, a makeshift stage where the mercy of the Children's Aid Society would meet the cold pragmatism of the frontier. A crowd had already gathered, a sea of sun-beaten faces, denim overalls, and stern bonnets. These were the farmers and shopkeepers of the West, and they had come to the station with the same discerning eye they used at a livestock auction. The inspection line was a gauntlet of quiet humiliation. The children were lined up on a raised platform, arranged by height and age, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. "Smile, children, look healthy," the society agents hissed, but joy is a difficult mask to wear when you feel like a piece of merchandise. The air grew thick with the smell of hay and the terrifyingly clinical assessment of the onlookers. Potential parents stepped forward, not with open arms, but with probing hands. They felt the boys' biceps to gauge their strength for the plow. They inspected the girls' teeth and hair. They pinched calves to check for sturdiness. To these settlers, a child was not just a soul to be saved. It was a unit of labor meant to tame a harsh land. Leo watched as the smaller children were picked first. The cute ones, the toddlers whose pasts were still short enough to be forgotten. But for the older boys, the scrutiny was harsher. A tall man with hands like cracked leather stopped in front of Leo. He didn't ask Leo his name or what he liked to do. He simply asked the agent if the boy had ever had the fever and if his back was straight. The man's gaze was devoid of warmth, calculating the number of bushels of corn Leo could harvest versus the cost of the bread he would consume. It was a market of human potential where the currency was muscle and the stakes were survival. The most harrowing part of the line was the sound, the muffled sobs of siblings as they realized they were being split. A brother would be chosen for a farm 5 miles north, while his sister was claimed by a family heading 10 miles south. Promises to right often were tossed into the wind, though many knew they were lies. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the line grew shorter, leaving behind the unmarketable ones, the sickly, the defiant, or the plain. Those who remained felt a double-edged sting, the fear of being taken by a stranger and the crushing shame of being unwanted. Standing on that wooden stage, Leo realized that in the eyes of the West, they were no longer children. They were a crop to be harvested, ghosts of a city whose value was now measured in the strength of their grip and the endurance of their silence. The transition from person to property was finalized not with a chain, but with a stroke of a pen. As the children were led away from the inspection platforms, the final vestige of their former lives, their names began to dissolve. For Leo, the moment came in the back of a dusty wagon, where the man who had claimed him, a stern farmer named Mr. Miller, handed him a new set of clothes that smelled of lye and cedar. "Leo is a city name," the man grunted without looking back. "From today, you'll be Thomas. It's a sturdy name for a boy who works the soil." Just like that, the identity his mother had whispered over him in the dark of the tenement was gone, discarded like the soot-stained rags he had left behind in New York. The erasure was even more violent for those with kin. On the platform, Leo watched a pair of sisters, Sarah and Maggie, clinging to each other with a desperation that seemed to defy the laws of physics. They had survived the death of their parents and the hunger of the streets by being one single, inseparable unit. But the mercy of the orphan train did not account for the human heart. A woman in a floral bonnet needed a girl for housework, but only had room for one. The agent, a man of cold efficiency, literally pried their fingers apart. "You'll be better off this way," he lied, his voice sounding like dry parchment. Sarah was renamed Martha and loaded into a buggy. Maggie was taken by a family heading toward the Nebraska border. They were stripped of their sisterhood and their names in the same breath, rendered strangers to their own blood. This process was a systematic cultural lobotomy. Many of the children were the offspring of Irish and German Catholics, their identities rooted in the rituals and rhythms of their faith. But in the Protestant heartland of the West, these roots were considered papist weeds to be pulled. Rosaries were confiscated, and the children were told that their past lives were sinful or shameful. They were instructed never to speak of the city, never to mention the parents who had failed them, and to embrace their new families as if they had been born of them. It was an impossible psychological demand. To stand in a strange house, under a strange name, and pretend that the first decade of their existence had been a fever dream. As the sun set on their first day in the Golden West, thousands of children like Leo, now Thomas, lay in unfamiliar beds, listening to the terrifying silence of the prairie. The name Leo felt like a ghost in his mouth, a word he was no longer allowed to speak. He realized then that the orphan train didn't just move children, it manufactured new ones by destroying the old. Their histories were being buried in the furrows of the fields they were meant to plow. They were the living dead of the American frontier. Children with new names, new clothes, and new masters, carrying the heavy, invisible corpses of their former selves into a future that demanded they forget who they were. The Golden West of the Children's Aid Society flyers had been a landscape of soft watercolors and smiling faces. The reality, as Leo, now Thomas, quickly discovered, was a monochromatic world of dust, sweat, and the unrelenting geometry of the plow. The romanticized frontier was a lie constructed for New York donors. For the children of the trains, the West was a relentless taskmaster. On the Miller farm, the day did not begin with a sunrise. It began in the bruised purple of the pre-dawn cold, with the heavy thud of Mr. Miller's boot on the attic floor. There was no room for the playfulness of childhood in a land that demanded total submission to the soil. The labor was grueling and physical in a way that the city had never been. In New York, the struggle was to find work. Here, the work threatened to consume the body whole. By the age of 11, Leo was expected to handle a team of horses that weighed 10 times what he did. His hands, once small and nimble enough to pick pockets or hawk newspapers, became a cartography of scars, calluses, and deep-seated dirt that no amount of lye soap could ever fully remove. He spent 12 hours a day, busting, sod, or hauling buckets of water that made his spine feel like a compressed spring. The vast, open horizon he had once marveled at now felt like a prison without walls. Every acre of corn was a testament to his exhaustion, a green sea that required his constant, back-breaking devotion to keep the wilderness at bay. For many of the orphan train riders, the placing out system was little more than indentured servitude rebranded as Christian charity. While some found loving homes, a staggering number were viewed simply as cheap, expendable help. Leo was rarely invited to sit at the main table for Sunday dinner. He was a hired boy who happened to sleep under the same roof. The emotional distance was as vast as the prairie. When he fell ill with a racking cough from the harvest dust, there was no mother to press a cool cloth to his forehead. There was only the calculation of lost hours and the stern reminder that those who do not work do not eat. The psychological toll was a heavy, silent burden. They were expected to be grateful for the opportunity to labor until their bones ached. The sun itself became a predatory thing. In the height of July, it hung over the fields like an unblinking eye, scorching the back of Leo's neck as he hoed endless rows of weeds. The heat shimmered off the black earth, creating illusions of the cool, shaded alleys of Manhattan, a cruel trick of the mind. In those moments, the ghostly children were at their most transparent. They moved through the fields like automatons, their spirits hovering somewhere between the lives they had lost and the toil they couldn't escape. As Leo wiped the salt from his eyes and looked at the calloused palms of a man's hands on a child's body, he realized the West hadn't saved him. It had merely exchanged the quick death of the slums for the slow, grinding erosion of the prairie sun. In the quiet hours after the lamps were extinguished, when the only sound was the wind scratching against the farmhouse siding, Leo, now Thomas, would sit by the embers of the hearth with a stolen scrap of paper and a nub of charcoal. He wrote to his mother. He knew rationally that she had been buried in a potter's field on Hart Island, but the heart of a child does not accept the finality of a grave. He wrote to his brother, who had been sent to a different county, and to the aunt he hadn't seen since he was 5. He poured his new, lonely life into these pages, describing the smell of the hay and the way his hands now looked like a stranger's. These letters were his anchors, his only way of proving to himself that Leo still existed beneath the calluses of Thomas. But the American West was a vast, silent void for the displaced. The Children's Aid Society had a policy that was as cruel as it was practical. They discouraged contact with the unfit families of the past. They believed that for a child to truly assimilate, the bridge to the old world had to be burned. Consequently, many of the letters Leo painstakingly composed never made it past the kitchen table. Mr. Miller, believing he was acting in the boy's best interest, or perhaps merely wishing to tighten his grip on his new laborer, would find the folded papers and toss them into the stove. Leo would watch the smoke rise from the chimney the next morning, never knowing that his heart's blood was being turned into ash before it ever left the county line. The isolation was not just physical, it was a curated silence. On the rare occasions when a letter did arrive from the city for one of the train riders, it was often intercepted by the local agents or the host families. They would read the desperate pleas of a mother who had finally found a job, or a father who had returned from the war seeking his son, and they would decide that the child was better off, not knowing. They feared that a single word from New York would act like a magnet, pulling the child away from the stability of the farm. Thus, Thousands of children grew up believing they were truly abandoned, that no one had ever come looking for them, and that their original families had simply erased them from memory. This silence created a profound, haunting emotional vacuum. Leo would walk to the post office in town every Saturday, his heart leaping every time the clerk shuffled through the mail, only to be met with a shake of the head. "Nothing for you today, boy?" The rejection felt like a fresh wound every week. He didn't know that 300 miles away, his younger brother was doing the same thing, asking for a Leo who no longer officially existed. They were ghosts screaming at each other from across a canyon of broken promises. The letters that never arrived became the most powerful objects in their lives, not for what they said, but for the agonizing emptiness they left behind. By the time Leo reached adulthood, he had stopped writing altogether, his voice finally strangled by the realization that in the eyes of the world, he was a boy who had come from nowhere, belonging to no one. As autumn descended upon the plains, the vibrant green of the corn turned into a brittle, skeletal gold. To Leo, now fully assimilated as Thomas, the landscape took on a chilling transformation. When the wind whipped through the towering stalks, it produced a sound unlike any he had heard in the city. It wasn't the roar of traffic or the shout of a neighbor, but a dry, rattling hiss that sounded like thousands of voices whispering at once. In the isolation of the rural night, the boundary between the living and the lost began to blur. These were the ghostly children of the movement, not just the survivors who felt like shells of themselves, but the spirits of those who had quietly slipped away during the transition. The mortality rate of the journey and the subsequent labor was a secret the society rarely publicized. Some children had died of railroad fever before they ever saw a farmhouse. Others succumbed to the brutal winters or accidents in the fields. In the local cemeteries of the Midwest, small, nameless markers began to appear, stones for children who had no family to claim them and no history to record. To Leo, these were the silent passengers. Standing in the middle of the field at dusk, he could swear he felt their presence. It was a heavy, lingering sorrow that clung to the earth, a feeling that the prairie was not just growing corn, but was also a vast, unmarked grave for the identities of the discarded. The whispers were more than just a trick of the wind. They were the psychological echoes of displacement. Every rustle of the leaves seemed to carry the phantom sounds of the New York docks, the distant tolling of a buoy bell, the cry of a newsie, or the soft lullaby of a mother long dead. For a child forced to bury his past, the subconscious has a way of haunting the present. Leo would often wake in the middle of the night, convinced he heard his original name being called from the edge of the woods. Leo. Leo. The sound was thin and mournful, a reminder that while Thomas did the chores, Leo was still out there, wandering the tracks, looking for a way back home. This atmospheric dread was a shared secret among the Orphan Train riders. When they met in town, they didn't speak of their trauma. They looked at each other with the eyes, a hollow, haunted stare that recognized the ghost in the person standing before them. They were a brotherhood of the displaced, living in a world that insisted they were saved, while their spirits felt tethered to a city they could no longer reach. The cornfields became a cathedral of memory where the forgotten could finally speak. As the moon rose over the flat horizon, casting long, spindly shadows of the stalks across the dirt, Leo realized that the West was not a fresh start. It was a haunted house with no roof, where the spirits of 30,000 children drifted through the rows, searching for a name they were no longer allowed to own. As the decades began to stretch and pull at the fabric of the 19th century, the only physical proof that Leo had ever existed was a single, silver-plated daguerreotype hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the attic. It was a small, heavy square of glass and metal, its edges tarnished by time and the damp prairie air. In the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, the image was a haunting miracle. It showed a small boy in a stiff, oversized coat, his hair slicked down with water, and his hands gripped tightly at his sides. But it was the eyes that arrested the soul, large, dark orbs that seemed to peer out from another dimension. They were the eyes of a child who had seen the end of his world and was now being preserved in a chemical amber. These photographs were the ghost shadows of the Orphan Train Movement. To the Children's Aid Society, they were marketing tools used to show donors the before and after of their charity. But to the children themselves, these images were the only evidence of their own reality. Along with the photos, there were the suitcases, tiny, tattered trunks made of boiled leather or cheap wood that had once held everything a child owned. A spare pair of socks, a lock of hair, a tattered prayer book, or a single marble. By the time Leo had reached his 20s, His suitcase had rotted away in the barn, but the objects inside had become sacred relics. To look at a child's suitcase from the Orphan Trains was to see the anatomy of a life interrupted. The haunting eyes in these fading portraits became a hallmark of the era. There was a specific look, a mixture of profound weariness and a strange, detached resilience that modern historians call the Orphan Train stare. In these daguerreotypes, the children never smiled. They stood against painted backdrops of Greek columns or pastoral gardens that looked nothing like the slums they had left or the mud-caked farms they were heading toward. The contrast between the child and the artificial setting made them look even more like spirits trapped in a dream. As the silver on the plates began to flake away, the images grew more ethereal, as if the children were literally vanishing from history, one pixel of silver at a time. For Leo, the daguerreotype was a mirror of truth. When the world called him Thomas and praised his harvest, he would look at the fading boy in the silver frame to remind himself that he had once been someone else. He wasn't the only one. Across the Midwest, thousands of these metal mirrors were tucked away in Bibles and cedar chests. They were the silent witnesses to the greatest forced migration in American history. These physical remnants, the suitcases, the fading photos, the scraps of New York newspapers used as padding, were the anchors that kept their spirits from drifting entirely away. They were the tangible proof that the ghostly children had once been made of flesh and blood, carrying a weight of history that was far heavier than the iron trains that had delivered them into the unknown. As the years passed and Leo, now Thomas, filled out into a young man with broad shoulders and a permanent tan, he realized that no amount of hard work could scrub away the invisible mark on his brow. In the tight-knit farming communities of the Midwest, blood was the only currency that truly mattered. To the local families who had lived on the same land for generations, the children who stepped off the orphan trains were seen as a strange harvest. They were labeled with a stinging shorthand. They were the train kids, the city strays, or worse, the genetic outcasts. Despite Charles Loring Brace's claims that the prairie would purify them, many locals believed that the bad seeds of the New York slums were baked into their very bones. The stigma was rooted in a pseudo-scientific fear that poverty and vice were hereditary. The townspeople whispered that these children were the offspring of the degenerate classes, drunks, thieves, and street walkers. Even when a boy like Leo surpassed the local children in his chores or his studies, there was a lingering suspicion that his urban blood would eventually boil over. If a tool went missing from a barn or a fire broke out in a hayloft, the eyes of the community turned instantly toward the orphan train riders. They were the perpetual suspects, the convenient scapegoats for any misfortune that befell the town. To the locals, they weren't just orphans. They were a biological threat imported from the East. This social ostracization manifested in 1,000 quiet cruelties. In the one-room schoolhouse, Leo was often made to sit at the back, away from the respectable children. At church socials, the train kids huddled together in the corners, sensing the invisible barrier that kept them from truly joining the congregation. There were stories of riders who, upon reaching marriageable age, were forbidden from courting local girls because the parents feared corrupting the family line with unknown lineage. They were a caste of their own, essential for their labor, but excluded from the community's heart. They were living reminders of a social failure, walking ghosts who were tolerated only as long as they remained useful and silent. For Leo, the weight of being an outcast was heavier than any sack of grain he had ever hauled. It created a profound sense of otherness that followed him into adulthood. He was a man without a pedigree in a culture that obsessed over it. Even his adoptive father, Mr. Miller, would occasionally look at him with a clinical detachment, as if watching a wild animal he had partially tamed but never fully trusted. This stigma forced the riders into a defensive secrecy. Many began to hide their origins, lying about their birthplaces or inventing fictional parents to avoid the train kid slur. They learned that to survive in the West, they had to bury their New York selves even deeper, becoming ghosts who walked among the living, always present but never truly seen. The dust of a century had settled into a thick, velvet shroud over the forgotten corners of the Miller farmhouse. In the year 2025, the house was no longer a bustling center of a harvest empire. It was a relic of weathered siding and creaking floorboards, waiting for its stories to be exhaled. When Sarah, a great-great-granddaughter of the lineage, climbed the pull-down ladder into the humid darkness of the attic, she wasn't looking for a haunting. She was looking for space. But there, tucked behind a stack of moth-eaten wool blankets and a rusted scythe, sat a small, battered trunk made of boiled leather. It was an object that looked entirely out of place, a piece of urban grit discarded in the middle of a rural sanctuary. The lock surrendered with a dry, metallic snap. As the lid creaked open, the smell of old paper and lye soap drifted into the stagnant air, carrying the scent of 19th century New York. Inside lay the physical remains of a life lived in the shadows. There was a stiff, tiny Sunday suit, its fabric brittle with age, a single marble that rolled to the corner of the trunk, and a stack of papers tied with a rotted piece of twine. At the bottom lay a daguerreotype of a boy with hauntingly large eyes. Sarah picked up the bundle of papers, realizing they weren't just documents. They were the letters that never arrived. They were the unsent cries of a boy named Leo, written to a mother who had died in a tenement and intercepted by a man who had renamed him Thomas. As Sarah read the fading charcoal script, the echoes in the attic began to roar. The letters detailed the terrifying rhythm of the rails, the humiliation of the inspection line, and the crushing weight of the prairie sun. The diary, a small ledger that Leo had kept in secret, revealed a man who had lived his entire life as a ghost. He wrote about the whispers in the cornfields and the stinging shame of being a train kid. This wasn't the sanitized history of pioneer bravery found in her school books. This was a chronicle of forced exile and the systematic erasure of a human soul. Through these pages, the man she had only known as the stern, silent, great-grandpa Thomas was replaced by a scared, resilient boy named Leo. The discovery acted as a spiritual bridge across time. The attic, once just a storage space for junk, became a sanctuary for a forgotten identity. Sarah realized that the silence of her ancestors hadn't been a lack of story, but a protective layer of scar tissue. The trunk was a ghost vessel, carrying the truth of the 200,000 children who had been shipped west to build a country that refused to learn their names. As she held the daguerreotype to the light, the boy's eyes seemed to lose their hollow stare, finally finding a witness after a century of being unseen. The echoes were no longer just whispers. They were a demand for remembrance, a call to acknowledge that the foundations of the American West were built, in part, on the broken hearts of children from the rails. The story of the orphan trains did not end when the last locomotive hissed to a halt in 1929. Instead, it went underground, flowing into the very lifeblood of the American people. Today, it is estimated that over 2 million Americans are the direct descendants of those ghostly children who were scattered across the plains. They are the sons and daughters of the Leos and the Sarahs, carrying within them a ghost DNA, a genetic and cultural heritage forged in the crucible of exile, labor, and forced resilience. For generations, this legacy remained a whispered secret, a shadow in the family tree that many were too ashamed to prune or explore. But in the modern age, the ghosts are finally speaking. This legacy is a complex tapestry of triumph and trauma. On one hand, the descendants of the writers represent the quintessential American success story. From the ranks of those street Arabs came governors, doctors, farmers, and educators who helped build the infrastructure of the Midwest and West. They took the broken promises of their childhood and hammered them into a new kind of stability for their own children. Yet, beneath the surface of this prosperity lies a lingering sense of displacement. Geneticists and psychologists often speak of intergenerational trauma, the idea that the soul-crushing experience of being torn from one's roots can leave a psychological imprint that lasts for decades. Many descendants describe a strange, inherited restlessness, a feeling of being from nowhere. That traces back to a great-grandparent who stepped off a train with a new name and a hollow heart. In recent years, the rise of DNA testing and digital archives has sparked a massive awakening of this legacy. Thousands of Americans are logging onto ancestry sites only to find that their family history begins not with a prestigious lineage, but with a cold entry in a Children's Aid Society ledger. They are discovering that their great-grandfather from the farm was actually a starving boy from a Bowery tenement. This digital excavation is reuniting families that were split on inspection platforms a century ago. Cousins who never knew the other existed are meeting in the middle of the country to piece together the shattered mirror of their identity. They are reclaiming the names, the Leos, the Maggies, the Seths, that were discarded in the name of progress. The legacy of the 2 million is a reminder that America is a nation built on movement, both voluntary and forced. The Orphan Train riders were the first great experiment in American social engineering. and their descendants are the living proof of that experiment's enduring impact. They carry the grit of the New York streets and the endurance of the prairie sun in their very marrow. To acknowledge this legacy is to honor the silence of those who came before. It is a realization that the ghostly children never truly left. They simply became us. As these 2 million descendants tell their stories, they are finally pulling the orphan trains out of the fog of history and into the light, ensuring that the riders are no longer passengers of fate, but the celebrated architects of a modern American identity. As the sun sets over the vast, undulating wheat fields of the Midwest, the long shadows of the grain silos stretch across the land like the fingers of a giant. In this quiet hour, it is easy to imagine the distant, rhythmic ghost sound of a steam whistle echoing through the valleys. The story of the orphan trains has transitioned from a lived reality into a haunting American mythos, but the figure of the child on the platform remains, the eternal passenger. This child haunts the national conscience not merely because of the tragedy of their displacement, but because they represent a fundamental, unhealed fracture in the American dream. The moment we decided that some children were surplus and that their identities were a fair price to pay for their survival. Why do these stories continue to haunt us today? It is because the orphan trains sit at the intersection of our greatest virtues and our darkest impulses. We see in Charles Loring Brace a genuine desire to save lives, yet we also see the cold, Victorian arrogance that believed a child's history could be bleached away like a stain on a shirt. The eternal passenger reminds us of the fragility of belonging. In a world that still struggles with the displacement of refugees and the foster care system, the eyes of the children on the trains mirror the eyes of the vulnerable today. They force us to ask the uncomfortable question: what do we owe to the children who fall through the cracks of our progress? Remembering America's lost children is not merely an exercise in historical nostalgia. It is an act of restoration. For nearly 75 years, the movement operated with the efficiency of an industrial machine, processing over 200,000 souls. To forget them is to allow that machine to win, to let the erasure of their names be permanent. By telling the story of Leo, who became Thomas, and the thousands like him, we are effectively stopping the train. We are allowing the passengers to finally step off the platform and into the warmth of a collective memory. We are acknowledging that their labor built the barns, their sweat watered the corn, and their resilience shaped the character of the American heartland. Ultimately, the eternal passenger is a symbol of the enduring human spirit. Despite the broken promises, the inspection lines, and the stigma of the outcast, these children grew. They loved, they built families, and they survived a system designed to make them forget who they were. They are the ghosts who refuse to stay silent, the whispers in the cornfields that grow louder with every passing generation. As we stand by the tracks of our own modern world, we look back and see them. Small, defiant figures clutching tattered suitcases, forever traveling toward a home they had to invent for themselves. To remember them is to ensure that no child is ever truly a ghost again, and that the journey of the orphan trains finally reaches its destination in the heart of our national story.